At precisely 3:17 in the morning, a perfectly pampered modern human can be lying helplessly awake on a multi-layered memory foam mattress, safely cocooned behind double-locked doors in a meticulously climate-controlled room, and still desperately think, well, this is absolutely it. My life is ruined, and I shall simply never, ever sleep again. Meanwhile, our remarkably resilient ancestors were casually trying to rest while maniacal hyenas cackled in the pitch-black distance. Highly inquisitive insects aggressively explored their innermost personal boundaries, and the absolute nearest emergency service was a sleepy cousin clumsily holding a slightly burning stick. So, why on earth does sleep feel so excruciatingly harder now? The most obvious, comforting answer is that ancient humans were simply utterly exhausted, dropped instantly into a coma-like slumber, and slept like heavy prehistoric rocks. Except, rather inconveniently, the scientific evidence suggests something far stranger. Many people living in traditional, delightfully non-industrial societies do not actually sleep dramatically longer than our caffeinated selves do. They frequently wake up during the dead of night. They naturally shift their slumbering habits in harmony with fluctuating temperatures, changing seasons, advancing age, and their nocturnal social lives. The crucial difference may not be that those ancient humans never struggled to catch some sleep. It may simply be that they did not dramatically turn the simple act of being awake at night into a full-blown existential crisis. To truly understand that comforting wisdom, we have to travel far back in time, long before cozy beds, before designated bedrooms, and certainly before anyone dramatically blamed blue light from tiny screens for utterly ruining human civilization. Before humans could sleep reasonably comfortably on the hard ground, our stubborn species first had to survive the extremely questionable evolutionary decision to climb down and leave the safety of the trees. For millions of years, our clever primate ancestors actually had a fairly sensible and logical arrangement. They would sleep high above the damp ground, safely away from hungry ground predators, balanced on sturdy branches or nestled in simple, leafy nests. It was admittedly not five-star luxury, but then again, neither is being violently eaten by a passing leopard, so the contemporary reviews of tree sleeping were generally quite positive. Then, rather boldly, our lineage became increasingly terrestrial. Naturally, this sudden lifestyle change created a massive, terrifying problem. The flat ground admittedly offered vastly more space, much easier social gathering, and eventually wonderful access to crackling fire, but it also inconveniently placed a completely defenseless, sleeping animal directly inside the prehistoric food delivery system. After all, a completely motionless primate is not remotely intimidating to a hungry carnivore. It is, quite frankly, just an easy appetizer with hands. Human sleep, therefore, could not possibly evolve as a mere isolated biological process. It heavily depended on collective technology, social cooperation, and primitive environmental control. In other words, long before we ever invented the modern mattress bed, we first had to ingeniously invent the concept of the bedroom. A carefully maintained fire was undoubtedly one of the most important pieces of this evolutionary puzzle. A continuously burning fire provided vital warmth, comforting light, pest-repelling smoke, and at least some reassuring protection against prowling predators and annoying insects. It also naturally created a highly visible, warm social center. Sleeping closely near others around a crackling campfire meant that incoming danger did not desperately have to be detected by every single sleeping individual at the exact same time. Just one light sleeper coughing, shifting weight, feeding the hungry flames, or catching a faint rustle of movement in the dark could instantly alert everyone else. This brilliant collective security system may have allowed early humans to spend significantly less total time sleeping than many of our other primate cousins, while successfully getting much more intense, high-quality sleep during that shorter, safer period. Compared directly with our closest evolutionary relatives, humans appear to possess an unusually efficient style of sleep, which includes a relatively high, luxurious proportion of rapid eye movement, REM, sleep. The fascinating stage strongly associated with vivid dreaming and complex memory processing. We did not somehow become the grand champions of sleeping longer. Instead, we simply became much better at getting the truly important parts of sleep done remarkably quickly. Our bodies also slowly developed incredibly strong, hardwired responses to light and ambient temperature. While gentle darkness helps prepare the weary brain for sleep, falling evening temperatures appear to be especially critically important in many traditional societies. In these cultures, people often begin sleeping several hours after sunset, precisely as the natural environment slowly cools, rather than dropping off immediately when the sky first becomes dark. Similarly, they tend to wake up naturally just as the cool morning temperatures begin rising. This, of course, is not the perfectly romanticized, filtered image of natural sleep heavily promoted by wealthy people who sell overpriced linen blankets online. Ancient humans were still undeniably cold, physically uncomfortable, occasionally downright frightened, and almost certainly irritated to death by someone loudly snoring near the crackling fire. But their chaotic sleeping environment perfectly matched the exact biological signals that their ancient nervous systems had slowly evolved to expect. Deep darkness, cooling night air, honest physical activity, reassuringly familiar voices, and a protective group nearby. Modern, climate-controlled bedrooms successfully remove almost all physical danger, yet they also tragically remove many of those vital ancient signals. We lie still, practically paralyzed after barely moving our coddled bodies all day, staring blankly at glaring artificial daylight, obsessively controlling the ambient temperature, isolating ourselves behind sturdy, silent walls, and then insolently demanding immediate, blissful unconsciousness at exactly 10:30 p.m. Evolution, quite predictably, never actually agreed to that rigid, bureaucratic appointment. The very first human bedtime routine probably began as a complete and utter accident. Nobody ceremonially gathered the tribe together and confidently announced, "Starting tonight, my fellow hominids, we will establish a highly disciplined, healthy circadian protocol." Indeed, there was absolutely no protocol. There was only crackling fire, bone-deep fatigue, terrifying darkness, and the rapidly growing realization that wandering alone through the wilderness after sunset was an extraordinarily excellent way to become a gruesome cautionary tale. Early humans spent their grueling days doing precisely the sort of strenuous activities that modern, expensive sleep experts still passionately recommend, although admittedly with slightly fewer apex predators actively involved back then. They walked immense, exhausting distances. They frantically climbed, heavy lifted, dug, hunted, gathered, loudly argued, meticulously repaired tools, watched unruly children, and occasionally ran for their very lives because something remarkably large with terrifyingly sharp teeth had decided to make the afternoon significantly more interesting. By the time evening finally rolled around, the weary body had thoroughly earned its deep exhaustion. And then Mother Nature's environment began lending a helpful hand. As the golden sunlight slowly faded, temperatures quickly dropped. Physical activity gradually slowed to a crawl. Fires were carefully built or diligently maintained. Charred food was eagerly shared. People moved snugly closer together, partly for basic thermodynamic warmth, and partly because pitch-black darkness has an uncanny way of making every rustle in the bushes feel professionally and personally threatening. That potent combination may have effortlessly created a powerful, deeply ingrained biological pattern. Extreme physical exertion naturally increased sleep pressure. Deepening darkness successfully reduced diurnal alerting signals. Cooling air gently helped the body lower its stubborn internal core temperature. A warm, flickering fire provided a beautiful contrast, cozy comfort, and a delightfully predictable place to finally stop moving. Bedtime was absolutely not discovered as a brilliant, marketable concept. It simply emerged as a very pleasant side effect of surviving yet another day. The fragile social environment mattered immensely, too. We humans are unusually and desperately dependent on one another, and the spooky nighttime probably reinforced that evolutionary dependence in the most comforting way. Huddled safely around a crackling fire, people could slowly process the chaotic day, exchange vital gossip and information, repair bruised social relationships, tell highly embellished stories, plan tomorrow's vital movements, and, of course, passionately explain why the disastrously failed hunt was definitely 100% caused by someone else's absolute incompetence. Such lively conversation may have delayed sleep slightly, but it also wonderfully reduced existential uncertainty. The group was securely together. The protective fire was alive and kicking. The dangerous, toothy world had been pushed just a tiny bit beyond the flickering ring of light. That comforting sense of safety is incredibly important because true sleep requires absolute, terrifying vulnerability. You simply cannot remain fully alert and vigilant while entering the deep, restorative stages of sleep. At some critical point, the complex brain must finally accept that it is safe enough to entirely stop supervising reality. For our ancient, wild ancestors, that deep trust may have come from simple, soothing repetition. The very same cozy camp, the same familiar voices, the same warming fire, the same reliable pattern of darkness, cooling, comforting conversation, and gentle rest. It wasn't perfect safety, but rather highly predictable safety. And as it turns out, predictability is one of the single most powerful ways to soothe a frantic, overstimulated nervous system. Of course, this does not mean everyone slept peacefully and deeply every single night. Sudden storms violently happened, colicky infants cried, stealthy predators crept too close, people became desperately sick, and hostile rivals occasionally attacked. Furthermore, someone almost certainly kept annoyingly poking the dying fire long after everyone else desperately wanted them to stop and just go to sleep. But temporary, midnight wakefulness was probably understood as just a natural, expected part of the night, not as catastrophic medical evidence that sleep itself had somehow broken. A weary person might wake up, listen intently to the night sounds, adjust their grassy bedding, check the dying flames, hear another nearby person breathing peacefully, and easily return to sleep. There was no ticking clock, no glaringly bright digital numbers, no frantic mental calculation that only 4 hours and 17 minutes remain before the dreaded morning meeting. Their accidental, magnificent discovery was not simply how to forcefully fall asleep. It was how to build a comforting nighttime world where waking up in the middle of the night did not automatically escalate into a full-blown existential disaster. For most of vast prehistory, sleep left almost no physical trace behind. Fragile bodies fossilize, and sturdy stone tools miraculously survive. But cozy beds hastily made from damp leaves and wild grass usually perform the highly inconsiderate archaeological trick of completely decomposing into nothingness. But at Border Cave, a remarkably preserved rock shelter nestled in South Africa, diligent researchers surprisingly found traces of something wonderfully domestic and familiar. Layers of grassy bedding dating back roughly 200,000 years. This was certainly not a mattress in our pampered modern sense. There were absolutely no fancy springs, no adjustable firmness settings, and absolutely no overeager salesperson hoveringly asking whether you happen to sleep hot. Still, this was far more than just some random, lazily gathered pile of backyard vegetation. By employing meticulous microscopic analysis, sophisticated chemical evidence, and remarkably well-preserved plant fragments, diligent researchers successfully identified specific grasses strategically placed in areas where these ancient folks lived, worked, and peacefully rested. Some of this primitive bedding delightfully appears to have been laid over thick layers of powdery ash salvaged from previously burned plant material. That dusty ash likely served several highly practical purposes. It cleverly created a cleaner, drier surface, helped isolate weary sleepers from the chilly, damp ground, and almost certainly made life thoroughly miserable for ticks, fleas, and other annoying, crawling insects. Fine ash, you see, can easily block or terribly irritate tiny, fragile arthropods, which playfully means our ancient ancestors may have brilliantly discovered organic pest control long before they ever got around to inventing the actual phrase pest control. There is also fascinating botanical evidence that some aromatic plants used at the site belong to the broad camphor bush family, whose fragrant leaves contain natural, oily chemicals that double as remarkably effective insect repellents. Naturally, our modern interpretation must remain scientifically cautious. After all, archaeologists cannot exactly sit down and interview the long-dead people who originally arranged the grass. We simply cannot prove beyond a doubt that every single green plant was chosen specifically as a prehistoric bug spray, or that each neat ash layer was deliberately prepared as the ancient equivalent of a freshly ironed fitted sheet. But the overall, repetitive pattern deeply matters. These ancient people were repeatedly, almost obsessively modifying the hard surfaces where they spent their precious time. They actively gathered specific plants, hauled them into the cozy rock shelter, carefully arranged them, burned the dirty old material, and promptly replaced it with fresh stuff. The grassy bedding areas also curiously contained telltale traces of stone tool production, strongly suggesting that these spaces were definitely not private, secluded bedrooms. Instead, they were lively, multi-purpose domestic zones. A bed, a busy workshop, a casual dining area, and quite probably a hazardous place where somebody inevitably left dangerously sharp stone objects lying on the floor. In other words, home. This fascinating evidence fundamentally changes our dusty picture of ancient sleep. Early humans were certainly not simply collapsing in a heap wherever sheer exhaustion randomly defeated them. At least in some places, they quite actively engineered significantly more comfortable and manageable sleeping environments. And physical comfort was by no means trivial. A thick, plush layer of grass insulated the shivering body from the freezing stone floor. A barrier of ash drastically reduced unwanted contact with creepy pests. Meanwhile, flickering firelight helped organize and define the occupied domestic space. Repeated, tedious maintenance made the wild shelter feel much more predictable and secure. Each small, clever improvement successfully lowered the sheer number of terrifying real-world problems the sleeping brain had to anxiously monitor. Of course, the silent archaeological evidence cannot tell us whether these prehistoric people suffered from agonizing bouts of insomnia. It cannot possibly reveal who woke up cranky at midnight, who snored like a chainsaw, or who became absolutely furious because a selfish bedmate had stealthily taken the softest patch of grass. What it does beautifully reveal is a very old, deeply ingrained human instinct. When peaceful sleep was difficult to achieve, we proactively changed our immediate environment. We did not immediately assume, with modern self-loathing, that there was something inherently wrong with the sleeper. However, this is precisely where our highly comforting, romanticized story begins to wobble a bit. We like to imagine that ancient humans lived purely naturally, obediently followed the rising sun, exercised constantly, and therefore effortlessly enjoyed flawless, uninterrupted sleep every single night. Well, probably not. Modern studies of the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in southern Africa, and the Tsimane in Bolivia have revealed that people living completely without artificial electric lighting often sleep for a modest 6 to 7 hours. This is hardly the mythical 9-hour wilderness coma we so idealistically might expect. They also generally do not fall asleep the very second the sun sets, either. Lively evening conversation, late-night food preparation, diligent fire tending, and delightful social activity can easily keep people quite awake for several lively hours after total darkness arrives. So, our first major reality-checking correction is remarkably simple. Natural sleep is not necessarily longer or superior sleep. It is also not perfectly, beautifully consistent. Sleep timing and overall duration can wildly vary from one chaotic night to another, between changing seasons, and certainly among unique individuals. Drastic temperature swings, daily physical workload, unexpected illness, exhausting child care, nagging hunger, snorts loudly dramatic social events, and random environmental disturbances all deeply matter. Ancient people, after all, were complex humans, not highly synchronized woodland appliances. Furthermore, there is also that famous, widely discussed idea of segmented sleep, where people sleep soundly for several hours, wake up peacefully around midnight, and then eventually return to bed for a cozy second sleep. Historical records strongly suggest this particular pattern existed quite comfortably in various scattered parts of pre-industrial Europe. Yet, whether this segmented slumber was truly universal, biologically preferred by our deep evolutionary design, or directly representative of genuine prehistoric sleep remains hotly debated. After all, a 17th-century peasant farmer, despite his rustic simplicity, is definitely not just a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer who happens to possess slightly better paperwork. Then, of course, we run into an even larger, rather inconvenient problem. Living traditional communities are frequently and enthusiastically used by eager scientists to explore how humans might have slept before the tyranny of industrial technology. But they are stubbornly not fossils. The modern Hadza, San, and Tsimane peoples actually live in the modern world. They interact with neighboring populations, face very current political and economic pressures, and possess their own delightfully distinct, evolving histories. Intrepid researchers can certainly use them to test clever hypotheses, but they absolutely cannot use them as convenient, DeLorean-style time machines. Furthermore, we also have no reliable, scientifically sound way to measure prehistoric insomnia. Archaeology can beautifully preserve fossilized bedding, ancient hearths, sturdy shelters, and even prehistoric parasites, but it utterly fails to preserve that classic, agonizing midnight thought. Why on earth am I still awake? Even from 80,000 years ago, ancient humans almost certainly experienced sleeplessness. Pain, nasty infections, late-stage pregnancy, heavy grief, social conflict, gnawing hunger, extreme weather, and primal fear do not suddenly become pleasant and manageable simply because nobody has invented annoying work emails yet. The real, fascinating debate is not whether they ever slept badly, but rather whether they interpreted a terrible night's sleep the way we painfully do today. Modern insomnia is uniquely cruel, often containing an agonizing second layer of mental suffering. Intense anxiety about the dire consequences of actually being awake. We obsessively monitor the digital clock, morbidly predict tomorrow's inevitable failures, frantically search random symptoms online, desperately calculate lost hours of rest, and consequently become increasingly alert and twitchy while trying to aggressively force ourselves into sweet unconsciousness. It is truly an incredibly impressive, self-defeating strategy. Ancient sleepers, fortunately, may have lacked that particular, self-sabotaging feedback loop. A sudden nighttime awakening could certainly be highly inconvenient or even dangerous, but it was also entirely ordinary. Someone else in the dark might be awake too. The dying fire might need a bit of attention. A restless child might stir. The cozy group might briefly mumble and talk before settling back down to sleep again. There was absolutely no universal, pristine prehistoric sleep pattern, no guaranteed, unbroken 8-hour block, and certainly no mythical Eden-like paradise of permanently well-rested, glowing hunter-gatherers. But, crucially, there may have been far less social pressure to sleep perfectly. And psychological pressure, unfortunately, is exceptionally and exquisitely good at keeping a stubborn human brain wide awake. A prehistoric camp did not actually need everyone to be fast asleep at the exact same time. In fact, that would have been spectacularly terrible planning. If every single member of a tight-knit group entered deep, blissful sleep simultaneously, the camp would essentially become an open buffet for predators, completely devoid of security staff. But, quite naturally, humans differ wildly in when they feel tired, how lightly they sleep, and how often they wake up. Energetic younger people often stay awake much later, while older adults frequently wake up much earlier. Meanwhile, tiny infants operate according to a frantic daily schedule designed entirely by pure chaos. Put all those biological differences together, and something wonderfully useful happens. Someone is almost always awake. Astute researchers studying the Hadza found surprisingly very little time during the entire night when every single adult in a camp appeared to be asleep at the exact same time. Across many observation nights, natural differences in sleep timing created beautifully overlapping periods of quiet wakefulness. This fascinating observation has inspired what is known as the Sentinel hypothesis. Human variation in sleep patterns may have crucially helped ancient groups maintain an informal, relaxed vigilance without ever needing to assign one deeply miserable, sleepy person to stare blankly into the pitch darkness for 8 grueling hours. There was, of course, no official night watch rota neatly taped beside the cave entrance. The collective tribe itself was the organic alarm system. An older adult waking peacefully before dawn might easily hear an unusual movement near the camp. A sleep-deprived mother nursing a hungry infant could notice a dying fire and throw on a log. A late-sleeping, rebellious teenager might still be quietly whispering with friends while everyone else rested. Even brief, fleeting awakenings could easily create scattered, vital moments of natural surveillance. This does not necessarily mean ancient humans evolved specifically so grandparents could helpfully detect lurking lions at 4 in the morning. Biological evolution is rarely quite that tidy and convenient. Age-related changes in sleep architecture may have many different causes, and modern evidence from living communities cannot definitively prove exactly how ancient Paleolithic groups behaved. But the broader, overarching logic is incredibly strong. Sleep was, at its very core, deeply social. The group reduced individual vulnerability quite wonderfully. Fire, that magnificent prehistoric invention, helpfully extended the useful hours of the day, actively discouraged some of the more polite predators, and created a cozy, smoky venue for endless conversation. Shared sleeping arrangements naturally provided much-needed warmth and made any highly unusual, suspicious sounds far easier to detect. Having familiar, slightly smelly people nearby offered a comforting kind of biological reassurance, something that modern deadbolts, security cameras, and fancy motion sensors desperately try to imitate, albeit without the charming feature of breathing loudly right beside you. Nighttime also became deeply and culturally meaningful. These glowing fireside hours allowed for the sharing of dramatic stories, grand myths, delicious gossip, educational teaching, awkward courtship, strategic planning, and the inevitable resolution of petty conflicts. A few particularly observant anthropologists have argued that conversations after dark naturally tend to become far more imaginative and socially focused than mundane daytime chatter. After all, practical daylight was strictly reserved for the stressful business of finding calories. Flicker-lit firelight, however, was dedicated to the much grander task of confidently explaining the entire universe. As human groups grew progressively larger and settlements became reassuringly permanent, nighttime behavior became increasingly, almost obsessively, organized. Smoldering hearths firmly anchored entire households. Elaborate rituals solemnly marked the daily transition into slumber. Soothing songs, earnest prayers, supposedly protective superstitious objects, strict sleeping arrangements, and highly specific rules about who slept were successfully turned a simple biological necessity into a grand cultural institution. Sleep was no longer merely the boring moment when the physical body temporarily shut down. It slowly became a repeated, sacred act of trust. You trusted the flickering fire to miraculously remain alive. You trusted the heavily snoring people around you to somehow notice approaching danger. You trusted that waking up briefly in the dark did not mean your night had catastrophically failed. Modern sleepers, by contrast, are often entirely alone with their racing thoughts, their mocking alarm clocks, and the highly unrealistic expectation that sleep should arrive instantly and remain completely uninterrupted. Ancient sleepers may have faced significantly more physical danger lurking just outside their cozy circle of light, but inside it, they possessed something many luxury modern bedrooms sorely lack: a tribe. The relentless modern world did not actually eliminate the terrifying dangers surrounding sleep. It merely replaced them with more polite anxieties. The hungry leopard lurking outside the firelight simply evolved into tomorrow's looming work deadline. The hostile neighboring tribe became a passive-aggressive work email marked highly urgent. The unpredictable night became a glowing digital clock that quietly, smugly informs you that you have now failed to sleep for exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes. Our ancient, easily panicked nervous system treats any uncertainty deadly seriously, even when the looming threat is merely a PowerPoint presentation scheduled for 9 a.m. Artificial light artificially extends our day. Glowing screens greedily deliver cheap novelty long after the sun has set. Indoor temperature remains stubbornly, unnaturally unchanged. Rigid work schedules mercilessly demand the exact same waking time in every single season, utterly regardless of when the exhausted body actually became tired. Many modern humans spend their frantic days physically inactive, socially overstimulated, and mentally unfinished. Then we suddenly enter a silent, dark room and confidently expect the complex brain to switch off instantly like a cheap desk lamp. When it stubbornly does not, we predictably start trying much harder. And that, of course, is the ultimate trap. Sleep is one of those frustratingly few biological processes that becomes exponentially more difficult the more aggressively it is pursued. You can easily choose to eat. You can consciously decide to walk. But you absolutely cannot command deep, restorative sleep through sheer force of willpower and determination. To be fair, ancient humans probably had their fair share of absolutely terrible nights. They endured physical pain, biting cold, relentless insects, crying prehistoric children, gnawing hunger, violent storms, and highly motivated predators. But they crucially did not carry our heavy modern belief that every single nocturnal awakening was an abnormal medical failure. In their world, every short night was just a routine hazard, not a psychological crisis demanding a formal investigation. Their sleep was wonderfully flexible because their nights were communal, seasonal, and delightfully imperfect. Ours, by contrast, is meticulously measured. Now, that does not mean the ultimate solution is to dramatically throw away your comfortable mattress, cancel your electricity bill, and invite several distant relatives to sleep huddled around a smoky fire in your cramped living room. Your landlord would almost certainly have some legal concerns. Rather, it simply means remembering the fundamental pillars upon which human sleep was originally built. Physical movement during the bright day, deep darkness at night, cooling ambient temperatures, familiar comforting routines, social safety, and the gentle acceptance that a little wakefulness sometimes naturally belongs inside sleep. Perhaps those ancient humans did not possess some magical, secret technique for instant unconsciousness. Perhaps they simply trusted the dark night far more than we do. At 3:17 in the morning, the frustrated person staring blankly at the ceiling is not some broken, defective version of a prehistoric human. They are merely a perfectly normal prehistoric nervous system helplessly trapped in a bewildering world of ticking clocks, buzzing notifications, and looming tomorrow morning expectations. Our ancient ancestors huddled outside the cave heard a wild hyena and comfortably thought, "Someone is awake. We are probably safe." We merely stare at the clock and think, "I have utterly ruined Tuesday." Frankly, that hyena may have been easier.